never yelled. I never made a scene. I didn't walk away in anger. I walked away quietly. People think distance always comes from hate. Sometimes it comes from healing. This isn't a story about rebellion. It's about boundaries. And the moment I realized loving my family didn't mean losing myself, people didn't notice the silence at first. Silence rarely announces itself. There was no dramatic goodbye, no angry post, no interview explaining everything. I didn't wake up one day and decide to disappear. It happened slowly, quietly, almost gently. At first, it was just fewer posts, then fewer appearances, then fewer explanations, and eventually no explanations at all. From the outside, it probably looked confusing. People were used to seeing my life shared openly, birthdays, milestones, smiles lined up perfectly for the camera. So when that stopped, the question started circulating quietly, just like the silence itself. What happened? The truth is, nothing exploded. There was no single moment you could point to and say, that's when everything broke. What changed was my awareness. I started noticing how often I felt small while trying to be grateful, how often my voice softened itself before someone else asked it to, how often I told myself, this is normal. This is love. This is how families work. For a long time, I believed that being a good daughter meant being agreeable. Being loyal meant staying quiet. Being faithful meant not asking certain questions. I was raised to believe that unity mattered more than comfort, that obedience was love, that sacrifice was always holy. And for years, I didn't question that. But something happens when you grow older. You start living in your own body. You start hearing your own thoughts more clearly. And once you hear them, it's impossible to pretend you don't. The silence didn't come from anger. It came from exhaustion, from realizing that constantly explaining yourself to people who aren't listening slowly teaches you to stop speaking at all. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I didn't want to create sides. I just wanted space. Space to think without permission. Space to feel without guilt. Space to exist without performing. People assume silence means avoidance, but sometimes silence is the bravest boundary you can set. I learned that you can love your family deeply and still step back. That distance doesn't always mean rejection. Sometimes it means survival. There were days I wanted to explain everything, to clear the air, to make people understand that I wasn't ungrateful or rebellious or trying to hurt anyone. But I also learned something else. Not every truth needs to be shouted to be real. Some truths are too personal for headlines, too fragile for debate, too sacred to be reduced to sides. So I chose quiet, and in that quiet, people noticed. They noticed I wasn't showing up the same way. They noticed the gaps. They noticed the distance. What they didn't see was how much strength it took to choose peace over permission. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of thought, of processing, full of grief for the version of myself that tried so hard to fit. I didn't walk away from my family. I walked toward myself. And that's where this story really begins. When people talk about fathers, they usually talk about warmth, guidance, protection. And I grew up understanding fatherhood a little differently. In our world, fatherhood wasn't just emotional, it was structural. It was authority woven into everyday life, into decisions, finances, schedules, even silence. My father wasn't just my dad. He was the leader of a system. And systems don't respond to feelings. They respond to order. For a long time, I didn't see that clearly. When you're raised inside something, it feels normal. You don't call it control. You call it responsibility. You don't call it pressure. You call it protection. I believed that for years. I believed that if I stayed within the lines, everything would feel safe. But the older I got, the more I noticed how narrow those lines were. Decisions about my life were often discussed without my voice in the room. Plans were made. Expectations were set, and my role was to agree. Not because anyone threatened me, but because disagreement felt like betrayal. That's the thing people don't understand. Control doesn't always sound harsh. Sometimes it sounds calm. Sometimes it sounds loving. Sometimes it sounds like, this is what's best for you. I was taught that questioning authority meant questioning love. So I didn't question. I learned how to smile while swallowing discomfort, how to say yes before fully understanding what no would cost me, how to quiet the part of me that wanted to ask, do I get a choice? As a daughter, my value was often measured by how smoothly I fit into the system. As long as I didn't disrupt anything, everything worked. But systems don't like growth. Growth creates friction. When I got married, something shifted. Not overnight, but slowly. I was no longer just someone's daughter. I was becoming someone's wife, and eventually someone's mother. And with that came a quiet realization. I was responsible for my own family now. That responsibility forced me to see things clearly, things I could ignore before. Questions about finances surfaced, about fairness, about who had control and why. And for the first time, I realized how little transparency there had been. Asking questions didn't go well. Not because the answers were complicated, but because the questions weren't expected. I wasn't used to pushing back, and the system wasn't used to being questioned. That created distance, not loud distance, not public distance, just a subtle shift in tone. Shorter conversations, careful words, unspoken tension. It felt like stepping slightly out of formation and realizing how much the formation depended on silence. I still loved my father. I still respected him, but respect doesn't erase reality. And reality was this: I was no longer willing to play a role that required me to shrink. I didn't want power. I didn't want control. I wanted honesty. I wanted agency. I wanted the right to say, this doesn't feel okay to me, without being told that my feelings were the problem. People assume distance comes from anger, but mine came from clarity, from understanding that you can honor your parents without handing them your voice, that you can love your family without surrendering your boundaries. The fallout wasn't explosive. It was quiet, but quiet doesn't mean painless. It meant grieving the relationship I thought I had. It meant accepting that some systems would rather lose closeness than lose control. And that realization, that was one of the hardest things to face, because walking away from a role means stepping into the unknown. And I wasn't sure yet who I was allowed to be without permission. Money was never something we talked about openly. Not really. It existed in the background as provision, as blessing, as proof that everything was working. We were taught that gratitude mattered more than details. That questioning finances meant questioning intentions. And intentions, we were told, were always good for a long time. I accepted that. I didn't ask where the money went. I didn't ask how decisions were made. I didn't ask what my work was worth. Because in our world, work wasn't something you measured. It was something you offered. But adulthood has a way of changing how you see things. Marriage brings responsibility. Children bring clarity. And suddenly, questions you were taught not to ask become impossible to ignore. I began to notice how much had been decided without my knowledge. Contracts, appearances, commitments made years earlier when I was young, trusting, and unaware of the long-term impact. I realized that my image, my labor, my story had value far beyond what I understood at the time. And that realization was unsettling, not because I wanted money, but because I wanted fairness, because understanding your own worth changes how you see everything. The first time I asked for clarity, the room felt different. Not hostile, not angry, just guarded. It became clear that transparency wasn't expected. That agreement had been assumed. And when assumptions are challenged, systems get uncomfortable. I wasn't asking to take something away. I was asking to understand. But understanding requires openness, and openness requires trust. The moment everything shifted wasn't loud. It was a quiet realization that my questions weren't welcome, that my voice disrupted the balance. I felt something settle in my chest, a mix of disappointment and resolve. Because for the first time, I understood that staying silent was costing me more than speaking up ever would. I didn't demand, I didn't threaten, I simply stood firm. And firmness in a system built on compliance feels like rebellion. Distance followed. Not immediately, not obviously, but it showed up in pauses, in delays, in conversations that no longer flowed freely. I learned that money in this context was never just about finances. It was about power, about control, about who gets to decide what matters. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. I had to choose, continue playing a role that asked me to give without understanding, or step back and accept the consequences of clarity. I chose clarity, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. That choice didn't make me fearless. It made me honest. And honesty has a way of changing relationships, especially when those relationships were built on silence. Marriage didn't change me overnight. It didn't suddenly make me brave. It didn't erase years of conditioning. What it did was give me a mirror. For the first time, and I was sharing my life with someone who hadn't grown up inside the same system, someone who noticed things I had learned not to question. At first, I defended everything. I explained the rules, explained the expectations, I explained why certain things were just the way they were. And he listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't criticize. He didn't tell me I was wrong. He just asked gentle questions, questions I didn't have answers to, Why did decisions about us feel out of our control? Why did asking clarity feel like disrespect? Why did I carry guilt every time I wanted space? Those questions unsettled me, not because they were aggressive, but because they were reasonable. I started realizing how often I justified discomfort by calling it loyalty. How often I ignored my own instincts because I believed obedience was safer. Marriage gave me something I'd never fully had before: permission to pause. Not permission from my parents, not permission from a system, permission from myself. I began to notice how different it felt to be listened to without correction, to be believed without being managed, to have my concerns taken seriously instead of smoothed over. That contrast was powerful. It showed me what partnership could look like: not hierarchy, not silence, but shared responsibility. As we built our own family, the priorities shifted. Protecting our peace mattered more than maintaining appearances. Creating stability mattered more than keeping everyone comfortable. That didn't mean cutting ties. It meant redefining them. I was no longer making choices only as someone's daughter. I was making choices as a wife, as a mother, as an adult with her own values. And that changed the equation completely. Some conversations became harder. Some expectations went unmet, but I also felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: confidence. Not the loud kind, the steady kind, the kind that comes from knowing you're allowed to choose differently without being wrong. Marriage didn't teach me to rebel. It taught me to evaluate, to ask whether the rules I followed were still serving me, to decide which traditions to keep and which ones to let go. That process wasn't celebrated. It wasn't encouraged, but it was necessary because I was no longer willing to build my future on the same silence that shaped my past. Marriage didn't pull me away from my family. It showed me who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to please everyone. And once I saw that version of myself, I couldn't go back. People often ask why I didn't speak out sooner, why I didn't go public, why I didn't tell my side loudly, clearly, and all at once. The truth is, I thought about it many times. There were moments when I felt misunderstood, moments when silence felt heavy, moments when I knew that one interview, one post, one statement could change how people saw everything. But I also knew what it would cost. Public fights don't stay public for long. They become entertainment. They become headlines. They become something strangers feel entitled to judge. And I didn't want my life or my family to become a battlefield. I wasn't trying to protect an image. I was trying to protect myself. Speaking publicly doesn't always bring freedom. Sometimes it just invites a different kind of pressure. I had spent most of my life being watched, analyzed, discussed by people who had never met me. I wasn't interested in feeding that cycle again, even if it meant people filled the silence with their own assumptions. There's a kind of strength and restraint that doesn't get recognized very often. It's easier to shout than to stay quiet. It's easier to accuse than to process. It's easier to explain than to sit with being misunderstood. I didn't stay quiet because I had nothing to say. I stayed quiet because what I had to say mattered too much to be turned into sound bites. I was also learning something important at the same time, that not everyone deserves access to your most personal truths. Boundaries don't need announcements, they need consistency. Every time I chose not to respond, I was choosing stability over reaction. That choice wasn't passive. It was deliberate. I knew that going public would feel satisfying in the moment. But healing doesn't come from momentary relief. It comes from long-term peace. There were conversations that happened privately, painful ones, necessary ones, and there were conversations that never happened at all because some people aren't ready to listen unless they can stay in control. I learned that I couldn't force understanding. I could only decide how much of myself I was willing to give away. So I didn't fight publicly. I stepped back quietly. I focused on my family. I focused on rebuilding trust with myself. That decision cost me approval. It cost me closeness. It cost me the comfort of being understood by everyone. But it gave me something else, peace. And peace was worth more than winning an argument I never wanted to have. Choosing silence doesn't mean escaping consequences. It just means facing different ones. When I stepped back quietly, I didn't lose people all at once. I lost them slowly. Distance doesn't announce itself. It shows up in pauses, in missed calls, in conversations that feel careful instead of warm. I noticed it in the way updates stopped reaching me, in how plans were made without my input, in how my presence became optional. No one said, "You don't belong anymore," but I felt it. And that kind of loss is harder to name because it doesn't come with a clear ending. There were moments when I questioned myself, moments when I wondered if staying quiet had been the wrong choice. Would it have been easier to explain everything publicly? To force clarity? To demand understanding? Maybe. But ease isn't the same as healing. Speaking softly meant accepting that not everyone would hear me. It meant allowing relationships to change without trying to control the outcome. That was painful. I grieved closeness I didn't know how to repair. I grieved the version of family I thought I would always have. Of these O's, I grieved the comfort of belonging without conditions. But grief has a way of teaching you what matters most. It showed me which relationships could survive honesty and which ones depended on silence. I learned that distance doesn't always mean failure. Sometimes it means growth happened in different directions. There were people who stayed, who listened, who respected the boundaries I set even when they didn't fully understand them. And there were people who didn't. Letting go of their approval hurt, but holding on would have hurt more. I also learned that softness isn't weakness. Choosing not to retaliate, choosing not to explain, choosing not to defend yourself endlessly. Those choices require strength because it's harder to sit with uncertainty than to fill the space with noise. I didn't speak softly because I was afraid. I spoke softly because I was certain that my peace mattered, certain that my children deserved stability, certain that I didn't need to be loud to be heard by the people who truly cared. The cost of speaking softly was distance, but the reward was clarity. Clarity gave me the freedom to keep moving forward, even when the path felt lonely. Quiet distance is often misunderstood. People think it means giving up. They think it means bitterness. They think it means something broke beyond repair. But quiet distance isn't about destruction. It's about preservation. It's what happens when you stop trying to force closeness that requires you to disappear. Over time, I stopped seeing distance as a loss. I began to see it as a boundary that finally had room to breathe. I learned that relationships don't always end with arguments. Some of them change shape. Some of them soften. Some of them move farther away so they don't cause more harm up close. That realization was freeing. I no longer waited for things to go back to how they were. I stopped hoping for apologies that might never come. Stopped believing that healing required agreement. Instead, I focused on what was real. I focused on the life I was building, on the safety I wanted my children to feel, on creating an environment where questions weren't dangerous and feelings didn't need permission. That didn't erase love, it redefined it. Love no longer meant endurance. It no longer meant silence. It no longer meant putting myself last. Love became mutual respect. Even when it existed at a distance, I accepted that some people may never understand my choices. They may never agree with them. And that has to be okay, because my life is no longer built around being understood by everyone. It's built around being honest with myself. And a quiet distance taught me something important. You can walk away without slamming doors. You can choose peace without declaring war. You can honor your past without staying trapped in it. And maybe the hardest lesson of all was learning that healing doesn't always look like reunion. Sometimes it looks like acceptance. Acceptance that people grow differently. Acceptance that systems resist change. Acceptance that choosing yourself can feel lonely before it feels right. But loneliness doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. Sometimes it means you made a brave one. Today, my life is quieter, not empty, just intentional. I speak when it matters. I listen to myself. I protect what I've built. And I no longer confuse distance with failure, because quiet distance didn't take anything from me. It gave me clarity. It gave me peace, and it gave me the space to finally live without fear.